if I'm facing a problem, the first thing I think, well, it's created by a human or a set of humans. So the solution also usually lies with the humans. So then it becomes a question of, well, whom do I find if I don't know the solutions myself to find solutions to that?
Better Innovation is hosted by Jeff Saviano, EY Global Tax Innovation Leader. This isn't just about innovation. This is better innovation.
Hello, Better Innovation listening audience. It's Jeff here. We're back today with another interview. Today we have Navroop Sahdev in the studio with us. Navroop is the CEO of an organization called the Digital Economist. That's a global impact organization with the mission to drive technological convergence for a human-centered digital economy. And they're launching the Digital Economist in just a few weeks from when we're recording this episode in Davos. She's also the CEO of an organization called Rethink Markets. That's a global action tank, not a think tank, an action tank focused on the economics of emerging technologies. Navroop is a leader in the space of economics of emerging technologies, and she also now has incredible new theories on the power of complex systems and technological convergence. I think you're going to really enjoy today's episode. Take a listen. Navroop, welcome to the program today. So happy that you came into our studio here. We're on Newbury Street in Boston today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Great to be here.
Really excited to have this conversation. You and I have been talking about having you on the podcast now. It's probably been about a year, hasn't it?
I think so.
And there's so much great work that you're doing, and we wanted to wait. We knew season 3 was coming, and this season we're all focused on artificial intelligence and advanced technology. And that is right up your alley. There's so much you're doing that we're going to have a great conversation today about advanced technology and AI systems and around the notion of technological convergence. But let's start with your big idea. What brings you in our studio? What's your big idea, Navroop?
So I think one of the key things that I've been obsessively thinking about over the past months in particular has been around the role of imagination. And that's not new to you, Jeff, and through our affiliation with MIT, and our intersection, that imagination in action. But really, looking at the world around, we take this for granted. This is the way the world is. But other than the natural world, the world around is imagined by someone, and we see the manifestation of that in real life. So I think I have been obsessed with thinking about, can we imagine better? And all the actions, the efforts, the conversations, what we've been building along with you over the past has been really answering that question. What does that better imagination look like?
I love it. And it's a great lead-in because we'll talk a bit about complex systems and the complexity of the world and where technology intersects there. And we'll bring it back to our listening audience as they're solving problems in the business world and elsewhere. How can they think about these principles and help them day to day as they address issues? But before we do that, let's pause a bit. I want the audience to get to know Navroop a little bit. Tell us about where you're from and your experience, where you grew up, where'd you go to school?
Sure. Yeah. So I have a lot of stories, but let's
tell us a story, Navroop.
So let's backtrack, and I'll tell a couple of stories along the way. So I'm born and raised in India, and lived there for the first 22 years of my life. Ever since, I've lived in 8 countries across 3 continents and 12 cities now. I'm currently based in Washington, D.C. And so I had a fairly common middle-class North Indian upbringing. Went to school in a town called Ludhiana, which is the biggest town in the state of Punjab in India. And it's an industry-heavy city, so also known to be either you're filthy rich or you're plain filthy. I think that sort of also points out towards this inequality that is there in the Indian society itself. And so, that sort of feeds into what I am doing now and have been doing and will probably continue to do in my life, which is looking at the human condition and the inequality in human condition, because I grew up looking at these inequalities and not just from a distance, they were part of everyday life, really.
So you felt it where you grew up. And it seems like that's the roots of much of your thinking today is you are knowing you are very focused on those inequalities and what can we do to improve societies that way.
Yeah. And I think it was part of my upbringing as well. So I think a quick story would be around, or an example, I should say, because this happened multiple times, where our father would buy us something. I have a younger brother, and he would say, the amount of money we spend on this is the amount of money that particular worker in the factory makes for an entire month. And he feeds his entire family in that amount.
That really made an impact on you.
Yeah. So, we knew all along what inequality means. And when I told the story to a couple of people, I think it was Steve Buckley at MIT, and he turned around and said, "That's a good father." And I didn't think about it that way,
at the time. Yeah.
At the time, or even now, until somebody said,
interesting. Yeah.
And I thought my father was making us aware of things, but I never thought really that this idea of human dignity is, fundamental to the values that we inherited from my family and my parents and my grandparents.
Important life lesson that your dad gave you that impacts the work that you do today. It impacts the challenges and the issues that you're drawn to.
Right. The battles you pick to fight and what you think is not worth it.
So 22 years old, you leave India. Where do you go?
So Italy. Io parlo italiano.
There we go. Okay. Excellent. Love it.
So in Torino, I did my second dual master's program in Europe. These are Erasmus Mundus programs funded by the European Commission. Really, really new content. I studied innovation economics, and I think that was formal training that set me on the path that I'm currently on. Obviously, for 5 years before that, during my first master's in India and my undergrad and even high school, we can specialize in econ. I had good, rigorous training on standard economics, but I think getting to the cutting edge really sort of happened in Europe.
And innovation economics is a fairly new field of economics, isn't it?
It is. I think with our current education system, we are taught to see the world in a transactional manner, in a reductionist mindset, where you do ABC and, then you can fit into certain buckets and that could lead to certain outcomes. But if you really look at the world around, it follows more of what we see in biology, where we have independent parts that interact with each other. And then what you see at the system level starts to look very different from the way these independent parts are, what they're depicting and how they're interacting. And what makes that difference is the interaction. So the interaction between two parts is not the property of any one part. So if I'm just studying, say, Jeff, we can talk about Jeff is a great guy and on.
I'd love to. Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
So, he's a great leader. He knows a lot about tax. But the thing is, the moment Jeff interacts with somebody else, there's another side of Jeff that, comes out. And
the interactions are important.
Exactly.
The connectors.
The connectors
are really important.
And they're ever moving and they're ever fluid. So to an extent that out of this, room, one person might get up and say, let's all do this. So a part of the system has gone on to create dynamics that can then impact the system. So, for example, you see a school of fish. So a lot of these notions come from biology. And in fact, a lot of the study of complexity science comes from biology. And we see that markets behave the same way. So if you look at a microeconomic agent, if there's a run on the market, it is prudent to pull your money out, let's say, off the financial markets, public markets, if it's not looking good, right? So you did the right thing, but if everybody does that, then we see a crash. So independent decision-making, or at least what we think is independent, the interaction, because it leads to these information cascades, then impact the system to an extent or at a level that was not predictable. And, the fundamental property of complex systems, which are everywhere, and the world is a complex system with many overlapping complex systems, is the unpredictability. So when we talk about the world is getting more and more unpredictable, that is true because the complexity and interdependencies in the world are increasing. The more connected we are, the easier it is to run information cascades, for example, even intentionally, and they continue to happen.
It's an important word that you use, the word prediction, and to think about it in the sense of these complex systems. I'm also empathetic to our listening audience. There's perhaps a few business leaders who are listening to the podcast today, Navroop. And if you think about any business, you mentioned a microeconomic unit. Think of a business is, of course, a complex system. And as I think of our listening audience and they have day-to-day decisions or more strategic decisions within a business, that is important to think about. And what's so fascinating about your work is the complexity of that system. And then we'll go in a minute. How do we look at technology to solve some of those issues that are complex issues coming out of a complex system?
Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting question. I want to differentiate between complicated and complex, just for the terminology.
Okay. Yes.
So complicated is a system which is entangled almost. There are no rules. There's randomness. And complex, on the other hand, is a system that has simple parts, but that are interdependent. And then it starts to show properties that could only surface at a higher level, if you may. So there are rules that define a complex system versus a complicated system. That is important to keep in mind.
That's a good distinction.
Yeah. And so that's important to keep in mind because a lot of times what we're saying is that this is a difficult situation. There's a risk. It's complicated, but it's not exactly complex. If you can break down the system to some of its component parts and uncover some of the patterns and some of the interdependencies, then you're dealing with the complex system. So with that distinction, technology itself is ever-evolving complex system because we see in our society there are a bunch of technologies that overlap. They come together in a convergence dynamic or they diverge. A single technology might downstream lead to or a bunch of different technologies that go from there. And so, deploying tech in order to solve some of these problems then becomes a question of understanding the system, understanding the interdependencies, and making those decisions around technology.
That's important. You said a lot there that I think is really important and gets to the heart of some of the theories that you've been developing, Navroop, around the creation of a technology solution. It's hard to imagine, and maybe this is from getting a little closer to your work, that you could look at a single technology and think that as that particular technology could solve problems within a complex system, that it really is about the interdependencies. And especially with technology itself, that the real magic happens at the interdependencies. I mean, talk a bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Totally. So yeah, we've been working on this notion of technological convergence, which we haven't invented, by the way. And again, it comes from biological convergence, where we observe species, plants and animals living in a similar environment tend to develop similar characteristics. So think of plants in a desert, right? They all have certain properties that they could live on less water and go on for a long time. So, and if you look at technology, we have seen convergence dynamics in telecommunications and internet. We've seen a lot of technologies that are embodied in a smartphone, for example, that independently existed, embodied in different devices. Now we put them together. That new combination is an innovation in itself. So innovation is not so much about invention alone, which is inventing something new, even a new way of doing things. But a lot of times it's taking the pieces that exist already and putting them together in a new combination. And that could be highly innovative.
And we've seen it now in practice. We've seen the power of what convergence can do in a lab context.
So what would be one of those examples?
Well, one of the examples, some early experimentation that we did when we first formed the lab on using blockchain as a new platform to solve big tax problems in the world. And we found, for example, that the data has to get onto the blockchain somehow. and using artificial intelligence tools to extract data from native sources and to make certain predictions of that data and then able to manage it in a better way to ultimately have that data be infused into a blockchain has been one really interesting area that we've found. This convergence of blockchain and artificial intelligence, we think together is much more powerful than any one of those technologies could be alone.
Right. Totally. And you make better products and you make better solutions.
You solve problems better too.
Right. Totally.
Yeah. I've seen it personally, the benefit of convergence. Give us some other examples of technologies coming together. You mentioned one really good one, telecommunications and the internet would be one great one.
Yeah. So, and I think other examples would be around, so 3 types of convergences, right, that we can talk about here. The first is particularly on tech, which is emerging tech and traditional tech, which we're already seeing. So, every time a new update comes to your smartphone, some new features come in. Essentially, they're deploying more and more AI tools, and you start to see like new photo albums that are coming that you can share, and they're making videos. So all these are AI tools used on more traditional data formats like pictures and things like that. So we're already seeing that. The other convergence I think we could talk about is the human and the technology. So that's the
Don't
science
forget
fiction
about
stuff.
The people. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't forget about
We're
the
not quite
people.
at that point where we can forget about the people. I love it. I love how MIT refers to it in some of the classes that we were aligned to at MIT. Collective intelligence, the collective intelligence of us as humans. We talk a lot about that within our lab. Collectively, we're better.
Totally.
Right? The best of humans and the best of technology. There are some things we find, for example, that artificial intelligence is just better. It's better at processing 1,000 documents than any small group of people could be.
So from an efficiency perspective, indeed. And so any one brain, however smart, however powerful, is not better than 100 brains combined. So that's also the power of crowdsourcing, right?
Yes, we all have limitations.
We all have limitations, exactly. Now, the issue with that is because it's humans, in case it's humans only, we have strong biases that have been evolutionarily encoded in us. And that's how we have this herd behavior, right? Information cascades, where a single point of misinformation can lead to certain movements in crowds or in financing or like investment patterns that are not correct. So a lot of what we're learning from cognitive psychology is, well, what are those human biases and how can we correct those? And so I think the most powerful and the most responsible AI is that intentional correction of the human bias that goes in.
I love how you said that. I've heard it explained a few different ways. I really like that explanation that it has to be intentional. There has to be an intentional act. We've had a few other guests on the Better Innovation podcast who have talked a bit about actions to take to ensure that you're not perpetuating the biases that exist in society today. As you hand over that decision making and you create these prediction machines, how do you ensure that the prediction machines are not perpetuating the bias? And I really like it takes an intentional act, doesn't it?
Yes,
you have
it
you
does.
have to understand that the bias is there. We had one of our guests on the podcast in season 1, Tara Lyons, who was with the Obama administration, was a policy advisor. Now she's executive director of the Partnership on AI, and talked about a great story of taking the AI capabilities and crafting a story and going to the public and having town hall sessions throughout the country. And what came out of it was a lot of hope and a lot of fears. And the fears, I think, were around how do we ensure that those biases that exist in society today are not perpetuated with these machines? And
right. So we have a body of literature from the 70s from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who have done a lot of work on behavioral economics. This particularly applied to economics, but they are psychologists. And their work has, impacted natural sciences, the biases, for example, doctors have, right? So that is somebody's life at stake if they don't make the intentional effort of correcting those biases. So it's funny because one of the stories around AI and around human biases, I think Amos Tversky was asked, do you study artificial intelligence? And he said, no, we study human stupidity. So,
the flip side.
The flip side.
Suppose, yeah.
And so those go hand in hand. I mean, humans are incredibly wondrous in the mental abilities they have, particularly the faculty of imagination. I personally don't believe that analysis is the highest skill that humans have. I think it's this ability to imagine something that doesn't exist, right? And then creating it.
That's right.
And it's so empowering when you sort of start to live out from that. But indeed, for building better systems at the mass scale, we need to think about what those are, and we need to take that literature seriously and correct those.
I'll go back to, I think, as again, thinking about it empathetically for our audience, that the Better Innovation audience we hear from often, and we'll talk about their problem solvers. That's what we all do. A lot of what we do, some people create problems too, but we like to solve problems, don't we? Especially in some of the roles that we have. And so as I hear that from our audience, and we try to guide our interviews on Better Innovation around that, talk for a bit about problem solving and the notion of technological convergence. And also that I love the session we were at together last year at MIT, AI plus human plus blockchain equals magic.
Right, right.
And that really struck me that it gets to the heart of this convergence notion, doesn't it?
Yep.
So talk a bit about using the notion of technology convergence to solve problems and make it practical for our audience. How can they use those principles in solving problems today?
So David Bohm, who's probably one of the best known modern philosophers, wrote this book called Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And his life's work is studying humans' consciousness and then how the world has evolved, if you may. So we have a fractional understanding of the world, and that is something we internalize in our consciousness, and then we perpetuate that reductionist fractional mindset. So I think what I'm trying to get to is that all of the problems are first created by that mindset, where we see silos, where we see divisions that are artificial, that either we just look around and take for granted, or we continue to perpetuate because we think that is just the way the world is.
I thought it was really powerful. You quoted David, as I'm sure you remember, in your TEDx talk. To paraphrase, he said, "Our thoughts are pervaded with differences and distinctions. It follows that we look at the world as similarly divided, a world broken up into fragments." That's a really important thought, especially and to go back to the discussion that we had about fragmentation and the danger. I suppose it's a danger of fragmentation, that problem solving isn't as easy as just looking at it myopically. But I find the best problem solvers are looking at how does that fit within the complex system that it surely is
Looking
within.
at the whole.
Looking at the whole.
Right. So that paradigm shift, I think, is the key. And one of the things I think from a more personal perspective that I tell myself is that if I'm facing a problem, the first thing I think, well, it's created by a human or a set of humans. So the solution also usually lies with the humans. So then it becomes a question of, well, whom do I find if I don't know the solutions myself to find solutions to that?
That's right.
That particular problem.
Right. What help can you find?
Right. Yeah. If you look at the world around, the wars, the politics, the whatever basic problem you're talking about is most likely created by humans. So
yes,
it could also
that's probably true.
Right. And I think it then would have to be solved by humans too. Now, of course, there are exceptions to it. For example, climate change, right? We are creating so much imbalance in natural ecosystems to a point that probably cannot regenerate. So we are really at the tipping edge. So then comes in karma, I think, where,
yes.
The actions are up to you, but the reactions are not, because they are a result of a complex interplay of factors that are not all in your control.
Let's think about somebody who is an executive within, could be a finance function, it could be manufacturing, it could be R&D. Let's think of somebody who has broad R&D responsibilities, for example, and they have familiarity with many different technologies. And I suppose one lesson coming out of today is to ensure that you've got a wide breadth I take from this conversation the importance of taking a wide swath looking at any particular problem. I mean, tell us more about, let's take that R&D manager who's trying to solve his or her problem. How does this notion of complexity of systems and convergence of technology, how does it affect that person trying to solve a problem in that particular instance?
Right. So usually if you're in a role like, leading, let's say, research and development at a firm, you are trained in a certain subject. You would usually come from a certain background and you look for solutions in that background. It's like you have all these vegetable and mushrooms and on your plate and all these different kinds, but all you see is, let's say, a mushroom. And so then you keep studying the mushroom and then you know a variety of other mushrooms. And so that is how science is working. But what it's missing is this hundreds of varieties of other vegetables that exist. So I think my own journey in doing sciences has been to be bold and not try to fit within the herd. Economists have a very specific pedigree. So at my time at Harvard Kennedy, I was very well aware that you have to write your papers in a certain way with certain language that signals that pedigree. But now it's like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Which other disciplines are looking at that problem? So it's more than likely in the 5,000 years that we've been on the planet and of some recorded history that problem has been looked at by other disciplines, or if not, then other cultures and mythologies. Ultimately, most of the human problems really distill down to a set of problems that Joseph Campbell talks about, and it's the same story over and over again. Now, of course, that's different from, doing science where we're constantly pushing the boundaries. But I think what's necessary here is to remember those fundamentals as we push outward in this journey to create new knowledge.
And much more likely, I think, to look at the benefits of having that wide lens view at problem solving and use of technology, that this is our own experience, that you're much more likely to find those magic moments when you look at problems that way and don't just look at, for example, one particular technology solution as the myopic solution, as the answer to that particular problem. It's a bit hard to explain. That's what makes some of
I think it's cross-pollinating.
So interesting.
For example, if you're doing medicine, there have been a lot of examples. You can't figure out a problem where they gave that problem set to a bunch of coders and they hacked it in like 12 hours. Something that, doctors haven't been able to figure out in years. So I think that thinking where you're open to other ways of or other perspectives on attacking that problem than thinking that it's only going to come from that discipline, and really the humility that goes with it too.
You really need to have that humility to open yourself up to. And we see that, I've heard it referred to as associative thinking. You're associating the problem to another industry and how somebody else solved a similar problem someplace else. And that's just give you one example of that. From time to time, we'll bring companies together across industries into a lab construct to look at problems together and find similarities. And I always find it more advantageous than having single sector clients together, single sector companies together looking at, because they tend to look at problems the same way.
Right.
But a company in the pharmaceutical sector solving a particular problem probably has something to teach an automotive company. And we see that a lot.
Yeah, completely. So markets tend to converge. Markets tend to move towards the equilibrium price, for example. Now, that's a very dynamic thing, but they tend to concentrate. That is something we know from empirical work. But on the other hand, innovation comes from divergent ideas. Actually, there's this very interesting article on innovation and creativity, more fundamental to it. Or, you asked a question around creative thinking.
Yes.
Is almost a biological activity. We can ask ourselves, is it something that's inherent? Something we are born with, something we just do as humans, or is it a result of education or other factors? And I saw this article from actually one of my friends, Moses Ma at Future Lab, that's on in Psychology Today, around innovation being a almost a biological activity, which is, like a baby making activity, where you have an initial spark, right? And then there's a buildup, then you have a breakthrough, and then there's a phase of a steady
plateau.
Equilibrium. Yeah, exactly. And so if we look at our own creative cycles, that's how an idea captures us, and we build something, and then we do something with it, and then it becomes a part of our whole selves, who we are and what we do and what we've done, our, resume.
It's a great way of looking at it. We studied disruption curves. It makes me think of, there was a field of, a body of work around studying the technology disruptions that have existed over the past 80 years or so. And you can show what the curves look like of adoption of new technology. And what we learned is that the slope of the curve matters.
Totally.
And you can study some disruptive technologies. For example, we had on in season 2 of our podcast, Steve Sasson invented the digital camera when he was at Kodak. And it was such a fascinating conversation. When we look at the slope of the disruptive curve, it was sort of a slow build, and then there was a rapid ascent. And you can contrast that with the disruptive effect in the semiconductor industry, which is a bit of the opposite. It was a very quick disruption, and you rose the curve quite fast. What's really interesting about, as we study disruption curves with advanced technologies, is it's just as you said, Navroop. It's a slow and steady growth, and then there's an event. There's a cliff event, and something happens. An inflection point, and we see the growth skyrocket, and then it may plateau a bit. Think of artificial intelligence.
Right.
Over the past 50 years that you've had breakthroughs. Think of the DeepMind breakthrough in the past few years, and how important that is. You'll jump up, and then you'll plateau a bit. That's something that we learned in our lab, and we study, is that the slope really does matter, doesn't it?
And that slope is getting more and more steep. Overall, I think what you're talking about is the sociological, the demographic theory of adoption of technologies, which is how a technology gets adopted over time in a society or whatever we are studying as our set of people. And because the interdependence was lower in the past, the technologies got adopted at a slower pace. And then something happened. For example, the internet came. Now that adoption curve is skyrocketing straight because you could download that app like today.
Well, that's a really interesting idea, that it's the convergence itself. I had never thought of it that way. But did I hear you right? That the point is that because of the prevalence of the convergence of technologies, that you'll increase the rate of adoption.
Right.
Accelerate.
So we have the conditions.
It's an acceleration.
It is. We have the conditions that are ripe. The infrastructure of the internet that exists already to piggyback emerging tech on, so that you would see a very fast adoption. And then you would see also the risks being much higher, and you would also see the challenges sort of being global in nature.
Really interesting. And I think it's a good segue. I'd love to have you talk a bit about, you've got a new venture. It's so exciting. We're getting to know, and I'm really excited to be part of too, which we'll talk a bit about, the Digital Economist. Tell us all about the Digital Economist.
Yeah, so it's been a few years into making, but the Digital Economist is an impact platform. It's a DC-based organization. And what we're really bringing together is the pieces around technology that is driving this convergence, these convergence dynamics, focusing on human-centered approach that Alex Pentland talks about to that convergence, and using those dynamics, and not just because technology is for itself, to achieve the global goals, the sustainable development goals. And we are hosting the inaugural roundtable of the Digital Economist in Davos alongside the World Economic Forum in 2 weeks, actually. And so it really is a platform to plug into for academics, for industry folks, for funders, for entrepreneurs. So, the idea is to have, again, the right combination that we talked about a few times during the course of this conversation, because, if in order to really achieve or reach that inflection point, what you need is enough entrepreneurial energy, enough money fuel, and enough insights. And all these things go together because you need those pieces together in order to innovate. And so with my background also in network science, this is probably one of the most important takeaways for me, not just, again, professionally, but also personally.
Yes.
That's how we bring together the best combination of things that could be.
You've taken great care, and I've found, and first, just want to thank you for asking me to be part of the council.
Thank you. We're very honored to have you.
It's a fascinating group, and I really am honored to be part of this great council. And I'm just so struck by the work that you and your partners have undergone to form the right members to come together. It does seem like you're trying to find that magical moment. You're trying to get that right combination of people. And you mentioned that there's many different types of resources. You can talk about human resources, the right people in a room to attack issues and to advance causes, but also financial and other resources as well. But it's about the people, isn't it?
It is about the people. That is perhaps our biggest thing, I think, perhaps to be proud of. The journey of building the Digital Economist embodies those values, right? And it's not so much about problem solving ABC. To an extent, we're okay with not knowing exactly where it's going to go, because innovation is an emergent property of the system. Innovation doesn't come in a predefined manner. It is the magic, the synergies, that emerges from that. And so with that, keeping in mind that uncertainty, the beauty in it, it's more about convening the right group of people and giving it some sort of direction, some sort of core thesis that this is what we are here to talk about, and let the magic unfold. The
diversity of thought, diversity of experience. We had on, and I can't remember, season 1 or season 2, Bea San Saith. And one of her leading guiding principle was that in a 75 or 100 person lab, we had people representing 50 or so different nations. And to get the diversity of thought and the diversity of experiences of people forming teams, we really learned from her and others that if you want to solve a problem or attempt to solve a problem quickly, build in a homogeneous team. Mm-hmm. If you want to find those magical solutions, then the more diverse that the team is, you find that it may be a struggle in actually solving the problem, or the work may be difficult because you've got such divergent thought there. But the outcome typically is proven to be much better, isn't it?
Yeah. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
That's so true. Davos, 2 weeks. We're going to try to get this episode out before so our audience can be prepared for that. And we'll both be there together, excited to participate on the Thursday of Davos. I think it's January 23rd, if I have the date right.
Yep.
Your session there. And we'll also be unveiling some work that we're doing with the World Bank and others in Davos. Exciting. It's a magical place, isn't it?
Yeah. So that is a place of convergence, I think.
It is. It's a great way to put it. Everybody has a big idea. I've never been someplace in my life where literally every person who we meet walking down the street and the sessions, that they come with big ideas. And it's an amazing place.
For sure. Talk
a bit about our other connection with Sandy Pentland and the Connection Science Lab. Sandy and I have a research collaboration together, EY and MIT Connection Science. I joined the lab as a fellow. You're also a fellow in Sandy's lab. It's been incredibly important for us as an opportunity to talk about the collective intelligence and to be part of a rich group of ideas that it really has shaped how we solve problems at EY. Mm-hmm. Why has it been so important to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, around 5 years ago, I did a complexity science short executive program. I think it was 2 weeks. It was 2015 or 16. And Sandy taught the portion on network science. And it's really been instrumental in, like for yourself, changing and giving shape to some of these ideas that I studied theoretically. Now, the thing about Sandy is, of course, he's a very practical guy. So it's not just about ideas. I think the sheer value he adds to the world by encouraging entrepreneurship, he truly is one of my role models. So looking at him, I have observed how you put those ideas into action, and I've seen how you constantly you relentlessly test your ideas and find the right fit. So, this balance of being brave, the humility, the openness, and yet at the same time, I think the persistence that has really come out by being part of that group. And of course, the biggest or one of the biggest values there is the openness of the members of that community.
It's true. Yeah, it's very, very open. And I look across the other fellows in the Connection Science Lab and come from a rich background and diversity of experience. I still remember the first year Sandy and I started to work together. He asked me to sit through and help where I could with one of the oldest innovation classes on campus called Development Ventures. And it was an incredible collection of students who had to come to the class with an idea that could positively impact 500 million people or more.
Wow.
So think about that. Think about the complexity, talk about complexity of ideas and the power of ideas. And they've been running it for the better part of 15, 20 years. And students come with ideas and they have implemented ideas that are affecting many, many people in the world. It's that bold thinking, and you call it the practical yet bold thinking of how can we change the world with these ideas. I've learned from Sandy since our earliest days together that we can solve big problems together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very powerful and very beautiful.
Okay, you've survived the interview, Navroop.
All right.
Now it's time for, we'll get a quick lightning round of questions. As if that wasn't fun enough, this is the really fun part.
I'm ready.
Of the Better Innovation Podcast. You ready for it?
Yes.
Okay, 3 questions. Fast questions, fast answers. What comes right to the top of your mind? Number 1, what book do you have on your nightstand?
The Hero with 1,000 Faces.
Tell us about it.
Okay, so Joseph Campbell talks about this journey of humans that has been the same, throughout the centuries, across mythologies, across cultures, religions, which is that of personal transformation, where the hero, which is gender neutral, goes through a moment of crisis or awakening, goes in search for the solutions, if you may, or the breakthrough, and then comes back and brings those gifts to the world. And it is that journey that is at the heart of the human experience, at the heart of all cultures, across mythologies. And I think one of the big things that I learned was discovering this beauty in mythology, which is the domain of human imagination.
Oh, that sounds so interesting. It reminds me of the hero's journey that we learn when we're thinking about how to improve storytelling. And
that's exactly what it is. It comes from his work.
Oh, it's so
the name of the
fascinating.
book is A Hero with 1,000 Faces. So it's
I can't
that same
wait.
hero's journey across.
Oh, you're off to a great start. Okay, that was great. All right, number 2. How do you see artificial intelligence, or based on our conversation today, Navroop, technological convergence, as impacting our lives day to day?
Merging with our everyday actions, where you see, AI playing the role, or almost like I kind of like to see that as a companion role, but I think what it really does is streamlining these processes, something that's a bit of a low-hanging fruit and is happening already. But I think what's even more exciting and perhaps drastic is where you start to see all these technologies merging, run by AI tools, and essentially what you have is something similar, magic stuff.
It is magic, and I think that is one of the major takeaways for our audience today is the power of convergence. Okay, last question, Navroop. Number 3, who do you follow on social media?
I follow TEDx, I follow MIT. Most of my social media is
Ideas.
These bold ideas. Exactly. And it doesn't matter whom it's coming from. In fact, one of the things is I don't like the word leadership. I think I probably mentioned that before. I like the word innovators because it can come from a 2-year-old toddler, or it can come from the look of kindness in your dog's eyes. And that might strike a thought, and you may want to go change the world or on a certain ground. And so,
those communities that we're part of, the Connection Science Lab and MIT and TEDx Beacon Street, it is all about new ideas, isn't it?
Totally.
Navroop, this has been such a great conversation today. Thank you so much. This has been a long time in the making, but really enjoyed this conversation. Looking forward to participating in the Digital Economist session in Davos. Lots of work to do between now and then to get ready. Right, we have a countdown, which we're launching our big initiative that we'll be telling our audience more about in the coming weeks. We're launching at Davos, and so we've been counting down since about day 73 to Davos, and I just can't believe that it's within 2 weeks now.
2 weeks now. Very exciting, yes. And we're really looking forward to having you, Jeff, and really the breadth of experience and innovation and openness you bring. So thank you so much for being a part of it. And, this is your own platform, and we strengthen each other.
It's very nice of you to say. Thank you, Navroop.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
This has been Better Innovation from EY. Let us know what you think about the show by leaving a review or by reaching out to Jeff at jeffrey.saviano@ey.com or find him on Twitter at Jeffrey Saviano. Better Innovation is produced by the great team at Hogarth Worldwide.